It starts like any other morning until an officer violently grabs a Latina woman's hair in the courthouse, treating her like she doesn't belong there. But there's something he doesn't know. She's not a defendant, she's not a clerk, she's the presiding judge. In just 3 minutes, she's going to walk into that courtroom, put on her robe, and expose not only him, but the entire system that has protected men like him for years. This isn't just about an act of racism, it's about years of silence, unchecked power, and a woman finally saying enough. What follows is a powerful reckoning, an unexpected turn in the courtroom, and a truth that cannot be buried. It started like any other morning, except it wasn't. Not really. There was something about the way the fog clung to the courthouse lawn that made everything seem suspended, as if time had paused to catch its breath before something irreversible happened. The mist hung low, hugging the wax where the first fallen leaves of October had begun to gathering in quiet corners. Gabriela Mendez quietly stepped out of her parked sedan, closing the door softly, as if in respect for the stillness surrounding her. Her gray wool suit hugged her tall figure, crisp and clean like the woman herself, and the soft shine of her leather shoes caught the edge of the light. Morning, as she climbed the stone steps one by one, she didn't carry power like a sword. She dressed him like a subtle, constant, undeniable breather. Dark hair, pulled back in an elegant bun, framed her face with a quiet pride, as if each strand remembered where it came from in her right hand. She held a slim brown briefcase in her left, nothing at all. No phone, no coffee, no signal to the world that she needed distractions. Never rushed. That too was part of her presence. Assaillant command that didn't need volume. That morning, she headed to work, as she had done hundreds of times before. But something in the air felt different, not heavy, not hostile, just vigilant. Inside the building, the echo of her heels met with polished floors and high time-stained ceilings. AF main entrance, where visitors passed through security. 2 guards stood behind the moving walkway, watching people advance with bags, belts, and anxious glances. Officer James Bradley leaned against the scanner as if it were his own. His stance wide, elbows wide, outward hand resting on his radio like a promise he could keep if given the chance. For Sotny. Shaved head, thick neck, thick voice, the kind of man who wore his badge like a second skin and believed every rule he enforced was a favor. Gabriel moved forward calmly, his eyes scanning the room without haste. Bradley saw her before she saw him. She noticed first the change in his posture, the way he straightened slightly, then tilted his chin in that half defiant, half contemptuous manner. She'd seen that posture before, not only in men like him, but in the institutions that built them. He raised a hand abruptly, palm to his chest. "Ma'am," he drawled, as if it held a bitter taste. "I need you to step out of line." She blinked once, the expression in his eyes unreadable but unwavering. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice low, steady, uniform. Bradley stepped forward, close enough that she could smell the sour coffee on his breath. His eyes narrowed, scanning from her hair to her heels. "Without visible ID, I can't let her pass like that," he murmured, loud enough for others in line to hear, but soft enough to deny the intention. Gabriela slowly reached into her jacket and pulled out a federal ID, holding it with 2 fingers, clearly and deliberately. "This should be enough," she said, extending it toward him without flinching. Bradley didn't even look at it. He took it, put it in his pocket, and looked past her shoulder as if she no longer existed. Something in his jaw tensed, but only for a second. "I'd like it back," he said, not any louder than before. He smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're in a hurry, honey." The word hit her like an old bruise being pressed. Behind him, a young officer, a rookie, by the looks of it, watched with a kind of nervous stillness, as if she knew something wasn't right but hadn't learned what to do with that knowledge yet. "I need to get to the 4th floor, Gabriela said. "Room 12. Bradley took a step closer. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was invasive, the kind that presses against your ribs even when no one's touching you. "Then my procedure will follow," he snapped. "Random check. Standard protocol. Come with me." She didn't move, not out of fear, but because she was thinking, weighing the consequences of compliance against the power of being a witness. Then she stepped forward, not because she agreed, but because she needed to see what he would do next. He grabbed her upper arm, not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough to insult. The hallway he led her down was colder than the rest of the building. Fluorescent lights buzzed like flies trapped in glass. They entered a small, windowless side room, painted in that kind of beige that makes a place look like it doesn't want to be remembered. There was a metal chair in the center, a desk in the corner. Gabriela paused in the doorway. "This is unnecessary," she said. "You have no legal cause." Bradley didn't respond. He pointed toward the chair. "Sit down." His tone was sharp. Now, acting grade, he wanted an audience, even if it was just the official one. The newbie was still frozen by the door. When Gabriela didn't move, he stood behind her and reached out. With a quick, calculated motion, he pulled her hair back. Her head jerked, her breath hitched, but she didn't scream. Her eyes burned, not with pain, but with suppressed fury from every year she'd had to practice this restraint. She stumbled but didn't fall. "Take your hands off me," she said through gritted teeth. He let go, chuckling. "You guys get so sensitive about everything." The room held a silence so thick it felt alive. The rookie officer looked away. Bradley adjusted her seatbelt as if nothing had happened. "You're free to go," she said, tossing her ID on the table. "Like a receipt. The 4th floor is that way." Gabriela didn't answer. She picked up her ID, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and turned around. Her shoulders were still square. Her gait was still deliberate, but something in the air had changed. She was no longer walking toward a courtroom. She was walking toward a reckoning. The moment she re-entered the main hallway, the noise of the courthouse returned like a slow, tidal wave. Heels clicking on polished floors, printers worry behind glass doors, voices rising and falling like the beat of a well-oiled machine that didn't pause for indignity. No one gave her a second glance as she walked past. No one noticed the trembling in her hands or the way she touched her scalp for a moment, checking the strands that were no longer. They settled down as they had an hour before. The air smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee, but none of it felt familiar. It was the same building, but not the same day, and certainly not the same Gabriela. She moved through the crowd like a ghost. No one could see the elevators opening, paralegals laughing in the corners, secretaries walking quickly, clipboards, but no one stopped her. No one saw what had been done to her. That was the part that stayed with her, the casual invisibility. If someone had screamed, if someone would have intervened, if just one person had said, "Hey, are you okay?" the day might have tilted differently. But no, silence was the true insignia in this place. It hung heavier than any uniform and weighed more heavily on those who had learned to wear it only to survive. Inside the elevator, she stood before the doors, jaw set, fingers curled tightly around the leather handle of her briefcase. Her reflection in the mirrored panel returned her composed but different gaze. A strand of hair still remained out of place where Bradley had pulled it, and she didn't tuck it behind her ear. She left it there, let it remain wild and unresolved. The elevator dinged, and as the doors opened to the 4th floor, a breeze of air conditioning met her face, too cold, too sterile, like the apology that never came. She stepped out and turned left, passing law interns and young lawyers who nodded, respectfully, unaware of the storm that had passed just beneath her skin. The walk to her office took 20 silent steps, each one echoing louder than the last. She didn't speak to her secretary, didn't check her email, didn't bother with the gown waiting neatly folded like armor behind the glass. She walked directly to the private bathroom, closed the door behind her, and looked at herself in the mirror. What looked back at her was not broken, it was boiling. She pressed both palms against the sink. She leaned in and exhaled slowly through her nose. "Don't give them this," she whispered to her reflection, but the words didn't carry much weight. Her scalp still stung, her pride still bled, and behind it all, deeper than anger, something colder waited. The calculation. Because now she had a choice. She could go through the motions, run the courtroom as scheduled, act as if nothing had happened, like every woman before her who had been insulted and told to be professional. Or she could do something else, something that would make them remember her. Not as the woman who she was humiliated, but as the judge who remembered every face that laughed as it happened. She left the bathroom without fixing her hair. She didn't need to let them see her, trying to make sense of it when she entered. In the courtroom, as if the morning had never happened, her own silence reflecting on them. In the hallway, her assistant, a young man in a blue tie, looked up nervously. Judge Mendez. "They're preparing courtroom 12. The press is already seated. The agenda is full this morning." She nodded once. "Don't change anything," he said. "Let them wait. I'll enter from the main floor, not from my chambers." The flickering, "Are you sure?" She met his gaze. Absolutely. As she moved down the hallway, each fluorescent bulb seemed to buzz a little louder. Every footstep felt sharper against the marble tiles. The courthouse wasn't hostile, it was indifferent. That was worse. It wasn't that they wanted her out, it was that they couldn't care less what happened to her. But that was about to change. She passed a group of law interns standing nearby. From the stairs, one of them, a young Latina with nervous hands and ironed pants, gave him a shy smile. Gabriela met his gaze, didn't smile back, but nodded slowly and deliberately. The kind of nod that says, "Yes, I see you. It's been you, and you'll be me someday if we make it through this." As she turned the corner into courtroom 12, the muffled sound of voices filtered through the heavy oak doors. Lawyers murmuring, reporters whispering, the faint clicks of camera lenses coming into focus. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them had felt the weight of a white man's fist buried in their hair like an accusation. But they were about to learn what justice looks like when it enters. Carrying its wounds like weapons, she paused with one hand on the brass handle and allowed herself to feel the fire one last time before the door opened. Not to burn, but to remember, because when the truth finally rises, it doesn't scream. It enters silently and dominates the room. Courtroom 12 wasn't just full. It was buzzing, the kind of hum you only hear when too many people try to whisper at once. when tension hangs in the air, like static before a storm breaks. Journalists lined up in the back rows with half-open notebooks and phones, silently recording in their laps, as the lawyers adjusted their ties and straightened their jackets, unsure of what exactly they were preparing for. The center hallway was clear, lit from above by a narrow skylight that spilled pale morning light onto the polished floor, like a spotlight aimed at someone who had not yet arrived. No one looked toward the double doors. Everyone assumed Judge Gabriela Mendez would appear from the private chambers. As she always did, quiet, formal, protected by tradition and protocol. Everyone was wrong. The moment the doors creaked open from the main floor, the room changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but the sound of her heels, those same soft leather heels clicking against the stone, attracted every head like a compass. Drawn to magnetic truth, she walked alone. No clerk, no gown, not even a dirty look. A crowd, and yet no one could look away. The bruised lock of hair at her temples still stood there, defiant, unresolved, and somehow more powerful than any gavel. No one said a word. The silence was absolute. Even the lawyers stopped turning pages. Even the camera lenses paused, holding their breath between shutter clicks. She passed the defense table without slowing down. The prosecution passed with equal indifference. And when she reached the steps of the witness stand, she paused. Not to take it, not yet, but to look up. Her eyes scanned the gallery like a lens. She didn't seek approval, didn't demand sympathy. She simply looked, and in that look, every person in that room saw something they weren't prepared for. A Latina woman standing not in defiance but in absolute, unwavering propriety behind the witness stand, folded neatly over the arm of her chair. Her black toga waited. She reached for it slowly with the kind of grace that turns fabric into symbol. One arm, then the other. The fabric slid over her shoulders like armor. Returning to its rightful frame, she didn't call for help. She didn't wait for the bailiff, and when she turned to face the courtroom, fully clothed, completely herself, the room felt smaller, as if the truth had just walked in and dared everyone to blink. The same bailiff from before. Officer James Bradley stood frozen near the side entrance. His posture was rigid, and his face was slowly draining of color. He didn't speak. He didn't move. For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in years, he looked like a man completely out of control. Gabriela didn't address him, not yet. Instead, he turned to the court clerk, who had already risen from her seat. "Is the agenda ready?" Gabriela asked, her voice firm, formal, and clear. The clerk nodded, stumbling slightly over the papers in her hands. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let us proceed," Gabriela said, lowering herself into the chair as if no part of her body ached, as if the morning assault had left no mark, but had left something deeper than bruises. An invisible heat behind her ribs, a fire carried not in rage but in restraint. She looked toward the counsel tables. "We will begin with the preliminary testimony in case 18,231 CC. The matter of Ramirez v. San Angelo City Police Department." Murmurs moved through the courtroom like a breeze. The people she remembered why they were there before, realizing they had just witnessed something far bigger than any she had ever heard. Gabriela's voice recited the charges. Excessive use of force, abuse of power, civil rights violations. The words cut cleanly across the room. Not loud, not emotional, just accurate. The way the truth is when she stops apologizing. Her eyes never strayed toward Bradley, though she could feel his presence. Like a shadow, trying to retreat. She didn't need to look at him yet. The longer she waited, the smaller he became. Power, real power, didn't need to announce itself. It simply sat and waited for the world to adjust. The first witness was called a young Latino father whose teenage son had been knocked down during a peaceful protest and left with a fractured shoulder and permanent nerve damage. As he took the stand, his voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the memory of pleading for help. As the officers laughed, Gabriela listened to every still muscle, every note taken carefully. When he finished, he looked toward her. Not as a judge, not even as a symbol, but as someone who could finally listen. She nodded once. "Thank you for your testimony." When the courtroom recessed, no one moved quickly. People stood there, half afraid that they would look away. This moment might disappear, but Gabriela remained seated, unperturbed, her fingers gently interlaced on the desk. The gown spread over her like silent thunder. Outside the chamber doors, someone whispered, "That's not a judge, that's a reckoning." They weren't wrong, because on that morning, in that courtroom, justice didn't enter in silence or in anger. She entered through the front door and brought the truth with her. The courtroom settled into an eerie silence after the first witness fell. One of those silences that doesn't feel like peace but more like a bated breath. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the building itself knew something was about to change. Judge Gabriela Mendez didn't move. She sat behind the bench, her elbows resting lightly on the armrests, her eyes level and sharp, observing the space in front of her as if it were a stage, and she already knew what the next act would reveal. The lawyers murmured at their tables, flipping through papers like some kind of nervous ritual, but their focus wasn't on them. She was still in the shadow near the back of the room, which was trying to get smaller by the second. Officer James. Bradley hadn't said a word since court began. He remained near the exit, jaw clenched, arms crossed too firmly on his chest. But Gabriela could see the tension in his legs, the restless shift in his posture, the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. Trying not to betray Panicus' once petulant and contemptuous face now looked pale under the artificial light. Waited a moment longer, enough to let the stillness buzz through the gallery like a warning. And then Har spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like glass. Officer Bradley said calmly, without raising his tone, without offering him a title he hadn't earned, "Please approach the podium." The whole room seemed to exhale at once, heads turning back, straightening papers, pausing mid-turn. Bradley blinked stunned for a second. He didn't move, as if the words had landed in a language he didn't speak. Then, like a man sleepwalking to his own doom, he took a step forwardsly, each footstep echoing a little louder than it should have. "State your full name for the record," Gabriela instructed, her eyes fixed on him without the slightest flicker of warmth. Swallowed, barely audible James Michael Bradley, and his position in this courtroom. "Officer Bailiff." "Madam, Your Honor." 14 years old. Her voice broke mid-sentence. She leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to look him directly in the eye. "In those 14 years, how many women have you escorted to that side room for random checks?" Bradley blinked again. "I don't have that number, Your Honor." "I do." She answered. 9 official complaints, all filed by women of color, all dismissed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for an answer that wouldn't exist. His voice didn't rise, but the precision in it carried like a bell across the room. "He didn't ask my name, didn't look at my credentials. He saw a Latina woman walking into a federal courthouse and decided that meant she didn't belong here." Someone in the gallery gasped quietly. Bradley's hands twitched at his sides, his fingers clenching and unclenching, as if trying to grasp something already lost. "She humiliated me, not only as a citizen or as a woman, but as a human being. And she did it with ease because no one ever told her there would be consequences." Bradley shook his head weakly. "I didn't know who you were, and that's exactly the problem," he replied. "She treated me like she's treated countless others. Others, not because of who I was, but because of what she assumed I wasn't." There was no need for shouting. There was no need to bang the gavel. The weight of her words settled in the room, like dust finally allowed to fall after years of suspension. Gabriela turned to her secretary without breaking eye contact. "Place Officer Bradley on administrative detention pending formal investigation." 2 officers stood without hesitation. The sound of handcuffs unlocking felt louder than thunder. Bradley flinched, taking a half step back, but didn't resist. He looked around the room, perhaps for help, perhaps sympathy, but found none. As the officers led him away, a woman near the back of the gallery began to cry softly, not out of pain, but out of release. The door closed behind him with a firm click, and in that moment, something invisible seemed to rise from the room. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was the faint sound of dignity returning. Inch by inch, Gabriela sat still and composed, but her fingers gripped the edge of the dais. A little louder than before, not out of anger, but to avoid shaking. Not out of weakness, but from the memory of how close she'd come to letting silence win. She gently cleared her throat and turned toward the courtroom. "We'll resume testimony in 10 minutes, she said. "A recess is granted." As people stood, they didn't rush toward the exits. Instead, they moved slowly, looking toward the bench as if unwilling to let go of what had just happened. One by one, silent nods met her gaze. An old man with a cane, a law student in a wrinkled suit, a young mother holding a toddler on her lap. They didn't speak, but their eyes said what words couldn't. "Thank you. We've been waiting a long time for someone like you to appear." And in that small, wavering moment among the cold lights and worn benches of a courtroom she'd forgotten how to see, Gabriela Mendez remembered exactly why she'd chosen to sit in that chair. Not out of authority, not out of recognition, but because sometimes the only way to rebuild justice is to begin with the truth. Spoken clearly, calmly, and unapologetically, Gabriela returned to her office that afternoon. The light had changed. The once bright and clinical sun through the upper windows had shifted to a warmer, slanting glow that cast long shadows across the stacks and floor. The courthouse had calmed somewhat, but not entirely. She could still hear the muffled scrape of shoes outside her door, the occasional tap of a keyboard from the nearby clerk's desk, and the low hum of the air conditioner cycling on and off, with a rhythm akin to breathing. The walls clung to the echo of what had just happened. A man in uniform led away, handcuffed not for a mistake, but for years of protected misconduct finally exposed. In public, Gabriela stood for a long moment just inside the room, one hand still on the doorframe, letting the silence settle before she moved. Her gown hung heavy on her shoulders, now not with fatigue but with a different weight. The realization that her authority had never protected, he had really only made his survival more fragile. He crossed to his desk. He pulled out the leather chair and sat down slowly, his hands resting gently on the unopened manila folder that had been placed there while he was in session. No note, no message, just his name, neatly written on the tab, and a string of numbers scribbled in pencil along the top edge, R9 through R21. He opened it. Inside were complaint forms, dozens of them, some typed, some handwritten, some with attached photographs or witness statements. Each one detailed incidents involving Officer James Bradley dating back nearly 10 years. Gabriela flipped through them silently, absorbing line after line like silent confessions. Women, Latinas, black women, young women described being searched unnecessarily, verbally harassed, pulled aside for security clearances, and left feeling scared, violated, small. A pattern clear as day. Each report had been signed off as resolved by the courthouse administration, including her former mentor, Judge Richard Wexler. Her breath caught when she saw his neat, confident signature, the same one she remembered from the end of his internship recommendation letter, 15 years earlier. The man who once told him he had the discipline for the high court and the face for the press had also, without a doubt, buried complaint after complaint, all to preserve the illusion of order. One memo stood out more than the others. A direct communication between Weasler and courthouse security. It read, Bradley's assertiveness is off-putting, but effective, especially with difficult types. Let's not escalate unless the media gets involved. He read it twice, then gently closed the folder and placed both hands on top. The room was still, but inside his chest, something had cracked. There was a soft knock. His clerk entered. His voice was cautious. Judge Mendez, he said. There's a request from the Inspector General's office. They're asking for any documentation on past internal complaints related to Bradley. Should I send this folder? Gabriela looked up. Yes, and tell them to request a full audit of the court's complaint handling over the past 2 decades. His clerk hesitated, including, she finished the sentence for him, including, every judge who signed those dismissals without exclusions. It begins with Wexler, then it continues down. He nodded, their lips pressed together in a thin line. Then he left. The door closed again, sealing the room once more. In its peculiar silence, Gabriela stood up. She removed her gown and placed it carefully over the back of her chair. It looked different now, less like protection and more like a flag. She walked to the window and looked out at the side yard, where golden leaves swirled in small circles near the bench where she used to. Having lunch as an intern, when S still believed that hard work alone could conquer everything else, Yabuz interrupted his thought. His phone lit up with a new message. Judiciary Committee requests urgent call about today's arrest. Senate may launch. An investigation. Didn't respond yet. Instead, he took out a notepad and began drafting something he had only imagined until today. Court policy reform, a plan that would require anti-bias training, independent misconduct review boards, and reporting public transparency. No more sealed Falesno, more disappearing complaints. He titled it the Mendez Doctrine, not because he wanted his name on it, but because F's system needed a name to answer to for what it had allowed. Outside, the sky was turning. Shadows stretched across the courthouse steps, where some people were now gathering. Not protesters, not reporters, just students. Algunos estaban solos, otros sostenían carteles que decían responsabilidad ahora, o protejan a las mujeres latinas. Un adolescente con una chaqueta de mezclilla estaba sentada en la barandilla de piedra, observando las ventanas de arriba cuando captó la silueta de Gabriela. No saludó, solo asintió pequeña, pero firme como si estuviera diciendo te veo, lo entiendo. Estoy aprendiendo de esto. Y en ese simple gesto Gabriela sintió que algo cambiaba, no la carga, no el pasado, sino el equilibrio de lo que vendría después, porque la toga ya no era solo suya. Para vestir, era una declaración, una advertencia. Una promesa, y ella tenía la intención de mantenerla. A la mañana final llegó con un cielo tan gris que parecía que no se había decidido a llover o a romperse en luz. El juzgado se alzaba adelante silencioso, pero vigilante, sus ventanas, reflejando un tipo de quietud inquieta que no pertenecía a ningún martes ordinario. Gabriela Mendez estaba justo fuera de las puertas, una mano descansando en la barandilla de acero, su respiración quedándose en su garganta por un momento, no por miedo sino por claridad. Todo lo que necesitaba suceder ya estaba en movimiento, no había más esconderse, no más doblar la verdad, en piezas más suaves y seguras. Hoy no se trataba de castigo, hoy se trataba de lo que venía después de que la máscara del orden fuera arrancada. Dentro, la sala del tribunal ya estaba llena, no con ruido sino con presencias. Las personas se sentaban hombro con hombro, activistas, abogados, pasantes, secretarios, jueces, jubilados, jóvenes estudiantes, madres con bebés, y ancianos con sombreros domingueros, todos esperando para ver si la justicia podía llevar realmente su propio nombre. Sin disculpas, la iluminación había cambiado de nuevo, suave, pero clara, sin sombras donde esconderse. Gabriel atravesó las puertas sin prisa, sin ceremonia, pero con ese ritmo constante que siempre había sido suyo. Su toga fluía ligeramente detrás de ella, como una corriente silenciosa, y el sonido de sus tacones hizo que la sala se pusiera de pie, no porque les dijeron que lo hicieran, sino porque sabían. Se detuvo en el estrado, colocó una carpeta encuadernada en cuero suavemente sobre la madera, y miró a través de la galería. Sus ojos se movieron de rostro en rostro, no buscando aprobación, sino reconociendo que todavía estaban aquí, todavía escuchando, todavía negándose. A apartar la mirada cuando se sentó fue como un sello. Cerrando algo irreversible golpeó su mazo una vez luego. Habló su voz baja y directa. Esta corte está ahora en sesión en la puerta lateral. 2 oficiales federales abrieron la entrada al corredor de detención. El oficial James Bradley entró flanqueado y esposado, ya no en uniforme, ya no armado, ya no escondido. Detrás de una placa que había tratado como un arma, su rostro estaba pálido, hundido, como si el peso de la semana pasada lo hubiera envejecido más allá de sus años. No habló, no hizo contacto visual. Simplemente se paró junto a la mesa de la defensa, manos al frente, muñecas atadas por el mismo metal frío que una vez había usado en otro sin pensarlo 2 veces. Gabriela no lo miró. Primero miró la carpeta frente a ella y la abrió cuidadosamente, revelando los hallazgos de la investigación, las quejas, los encubrimientos, las firmas. Él silenció que lo había hecho. Todo posible, no necesitaba leerlos en voz alta. Todos en la sala ya lo sabían. Levantó la cabeza Senor. Bradley comenzó su tono ni enojado ni frío sino inquebrantable. Esta corte lo encuentra culpable de todos los cargos. Abuso de poder, violación de derechos civiles y obstrucción de la justicia. No hubo jadeo, no hubo aplauso, solo respiración contenida y liberada como un edificio, recordando cómo exhalar por estos crímenes. Se le condena a 12 años en custodia federal, sin posibilidad de libertad condicional. Durante los primeros 7, será transferido a Uni Facility, designated by the U.S. Marshals Servicing, will not be placed in general population during the intake period. He didn't flinch, but something in his posture collapsed like a thread pulled from a knot held too tight for too long. Gabriela paused, then continued softer but sharper. But beyond the legal sentence, there is a human reckoning. For every woman he humiliated, every voice he dismissed, every silence he built in this system, he now sits in the seat he once filled with fear. He no longer decides who deserves dignity. That power is no longer his. He banged the gavel again, and the officers advanced without a word. Bradley was escorted out, each step heavy, not by handcuffs, but by the weight of being seen for the first time, not as the executioner, but as the accused. The door closed behind him, and again, the courtroom didn't move. It simply held the moment, like a fragile truth, too long unspoken. Then Gabriela turned to the gallery. Let the record show that this court did not serve order at the expense of truth. It does not protect tradition when tradition becomes a shield for cruelty. What happened in this courtroom is not an exception. It is a revelation. He opened a second folder, he lifted a document, and held it in the air. This is the Mendez Doctrine, effective immediately. Every courthouse staff member in this district will be subject to mandatory anti-bias training, quarterly misconduct audits, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. A movement swept through the seats like the wind through tall grass. Not outrage, not disbelief, but recognition. Like the first time someone dares to say the thing you've been whispering in the dark. For years, this is not about revenge, his calmer voice continued. Now it is about responsibility to rebuild something that should never have been broken. If justice is real, it cannot be blind to harm or deaf to history. He paused, looking down at his robe, his hands resting on top like bookends for everything this job had meant. When the gavel struck one last time, once again, no one applauded. They stood up again, not out of duty, not out of tradition, but because the truth had filled the room and left them no choice but to rise with it. Outside, the clouds had finally parted, and a single ray of light filtered down onto the courthouse steps where a crowd waited, not for a verdict, but for proof that justice could look like them. And today it did. At last, this wasn't just a story about a courtroom or a plaque or even a gown. It was about a woman who refused to cower. Even when the system tried to humiliate her into silence, Judge Gabriela Mendez didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She reminded us that dignity isn't something bestowed by uniforms or titles, but something we silently carry until the moment the world is forced to see. For many watching, especially those who have lived long enough to know what it feels like to be overlooked, dismissed, or told to wait your turn, this story speaks directly to you. It's a reminder that responsibility is not too much to ask, that silence is not neutrality, and that real justice is not about revenge, but about truth spoken loudly, even when it shakes the walls. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why we must continue to stand strong even when we are tired, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just because of the algorithm, but so more people can hear stories that matter, that challenge us, and that give a voice to those who have been silent for too long. because sometimes the most powerful sledgehammer is the one we carry in our hearts. Thank you for watching.